My name is Richard Drake, and I'm pinch hitting today for Albert Borkman, who cannot be with us this afternoon. Our speaker today is Hedrick Smith, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, longtime foreign correspondent for the New York Times, an Emmy Award winner for television work he has done, making documentaries and miniseries for I guess it's Frontline and other programs. He's also a heavily published author, most famously for The Russians, and now for Who Stole the American Dream. And he'll be talking about that book. Actually, his title for his lecture tonight is Who Stole the American Dream. That's going to be a presentation given in the Denison Theater at 8 o'clock. It will be the Lucille Spear Memorial Lecture in the President's Lecture Series. You'll be getting a full account of his manifold accomplishments at the lecture tonight when my friend Dan Kemmis is going to give the introduction for that presentation. This afternoon's seminar is entitled, Can We Reclaim the American Dream? A most pressing question for our republic today, it seems to me. I don't think we could have a more topical theme for our seminar than the one we're about to get. Please join me in welcoming Hedrick Smith.
Thank you very much, Dr. Flake. It's a real pleasure, Drake. It's a real pleasure to be here in Montana. One of my favorite spots is up in that great national park of yours along the border. We'd love to go up there and appreciate your country. I wonder if you'll indulge me in a sort of a reverse application today. I've got to figure out how to give two talks about the same topic and make them different, and they're going to be very different. What I'm going to talk to you about now is going to be very different. I'm going to reverse the order tonight. I'm going to talk about the problem this afternoon. I'm going to talk about the solution. So you'll have to assume, I have to assume that you know what the problem is, and at least you know that the political system isn't working, right? Polls tell us 75–80% of the people in the country think the political system is broken. Confidence in the American political system is at one of the lowest points in 40 years. Not only are the politicians all rated low, the president, the Republicans, the media is rated down in the pits. We're practically down there with the Catholic Church and all kinds of other good institutions, and so forth. And we're in the midst of an election that I want to talk about tonight, which is really fascinating. It's a fascinating upheaval. But the real question, we're so focused on personalities. We're so, we're a celebrity culture, we're a personality culture, and we love to focus on people. Is X going to win it? Can Cruz win Indiana? And can Cruz and Kasich together stop Trump? And is Trump going to get enough delegates? And we're all focused on that. But the truth of the matter is, when you think about an election, what you really want to know is, when we're done with it all, are we going to come out with a government that is going to work? Isn't that really what it's about? We get way far away from that in the media, and we get way far away from that in our personal conversations because we're so fascinated with personalities. Are we going to have an honest election? Is it going to be a fair election? Is it going to generate a government that can actually work? Is somebody going to be actually able to get something done? And we have rather massive problems in this country. Climate change and immigration, education, health care. If you're worried about the budget, you're worried about the cost of the entitlement program, Social Security, Medicaid, whatever it is. And you look at the record over the last 6 years, and unless you're really impossibly partisan, you really can't blame it all on Obama, or you can't blame it all on a bunch of Republicans in the House. I mean, you got to take a look, and you actually have to see that the people who say the system is broken actually have a reason for saying the system is broken. It is broken. It doesn't work. So when we're done with this whole process of 97 umpteen primaries and all this kind of stuff, and counting the votes and worrying about the delegates and an embattled and inconclusive and a brokered convention, are we going to have a government that works? And I'm going to contend to you that chances are no. The odds are really bad. No matter whom we elect, the odds are really bad. And the reason is there are actually 3 elections. You know there are 3 elections, but we in the media just feed them to you one at a time because that's all we can focus on, and we think that's all you can focus on. So all we're going to talk to you about, remember, if you think back on the media, right? The media told you initially that Trump didn't stand a chance. Then the media got really fascinated with Trump because he said so many outrageous things that we couldn't pass up telling you that he wanted to build a wall along the Mexican border. And we all know you can't build a wall all the way across the Mexican border. You can build some kind of a fence and so forth, but you can't build a wall. He made it, and then he was going to make the Mexicans pay for it. And then he was insulting to that Megan from Fox News, and said some things about menstruation and so on, and it didn't tell you anything about what kind of president he was going to be, except he was going to be a misogynist. But that was so sensational that we couldn't bother to examine what kind of policies he had. And it went on and on and on and on. Don't let any Muslims come into the country, whatever. And we in the media, we just loved it because it was such a, quote, great story. And why was it a great story? Because so many people were aghast, and it was a sensation, it was a scandal, and they tuned into it. And we've gotten all caught up with that. And now then the story becomes fascinating. Are there people who are awake to the fact that he's really a jerk, saying all these things? And so then we cover them. And then now we're back to the county convention. But the question is, why, if he's such a jerk, are there millions of people voting for him? Yeah, there are a lot of people who are prejudiced. There are a lot of people who are insecure. And there are a lot of people who want to find somebody else to blame for their problems. Now, I don't want to go too far into that because I'm going to talk about that tonight. But the point is, the media fundamentally missed the Trump story. Then it inflated Trump, and even after it inflated Trump, it still didn't understand the Trump story. So we can't really count on the media to tell us where things are going. If you recall, at the early part, I remember this, early part of the campaign, I said to my wife a million times, I've covered several presidential campaigns, okay? In fairness, I need to tell you that. The media was telling you how important the Iowa caucuses were going to be. Now, if you've paid any attention to American political history, you know that 50% of the time, the winner of the Republican Ohio caucuses goes nowhere. So you need to take a grain of salt before you even think about the coverage of the Iowa caucuses. It's happened again this year. Cruz has followed others who've won the Iowa caucus and don't wind up by winning the Republican nomination. So repeatedly, the media has not told us where we ought to be looking. And it's happening again. The second election besides the presidential election is the election for the United States Senate. Republicans have a 54-46 majority, so the change of 4 seats in the Senate could change control of the Senate if a Democrat is elected to the White House, because the vice president has the tie-breaking vote up on the Hill, okay, in the Senate. Well, it just so happens that there are 6 Senate seats held by Republicans, all won in the great Tea Party wave of 2010, right? 6 years later, here we're in 2016. So you got a bunch of very vulnerable Republican senators in Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and Florida. 6. In fact, one of them quit, named Rubio. So that seat's open. That's up for grabs. There are 1 or 2 seats the Republicans might pick up, particularly in Nevada, because Harry Reid retired. But that's a situation where you can see a change of party. Well, if Trump's the nominee and the Republicans win the presidency and the Senate changes, we got a mess. If Hillary wins, then that's a help. But what about the House? Aha, what about the House? This is why we can't get anywhere. This is why we can't get anywhere. Do you know what happened in the 2012 election, the last presidential election we had? This actually was an election. What are elections supposed to do? Elections are supposed to be the verdict of the people on the performance of the government and a direction from the people to the government in what direction it wants to move. And we basically tell that by which parties win the elections, right? So if we go back to 2012, what we see is President Obama, who was really in terrible trouble a year, politically, a year before the election. A lot of people, a lot of pundits were saying he's not going to get reelected. He gets reelected and he wins by, 3.5%, 4%. That's a decent margin for a president to win reelection. Haven't been that many presidents who've won reelection, particularly Democratic presidents since Roosevelt, okay? The second thing that happens in 2012 now is the Democrats actually gain seats in the Senate. All right? Democratic president gets reelected. Democrats pick up 2 seats in the Senate. So the public is saying something to the government about what direction it wants it to go. Well, what happens in the House of Representatives? The Republicans emerge with a 33-vote seat majority in the House of Representatives. So you figure, well, the public is confused, it's mixed, they've given the government mixed signals. That's not what happened. More people voted for Democratic candidates for the House of Representatives in 2012 than voted for Republicans. It was 54.5 million for Democrats and 53 million for Republicans. So in fact, the electorate did deliver a message to Washington: Democratic president, Democratic gains in the Senate, Democratic majority vote in the House, but something went wrong. Now we're talking about something real that is going to face whoever is the president next November. Because a good political correspondent today, in fact, a good political correspondent in Washington a year ago, could have told you the outcome of the congressional elections this coming November. What are we now? April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November. 7 months in advance, a good reporter could tell you the outcome. How is that possible? Because 85 to 90% of the seats in the House of Representatives are locked-in monopolies, gerrymandered by one or the other of the 2 parties. Let me tell you that's fact again, because it's really important. This election is about the agenda of my book, Who Stole the American Dream? That has to be dealt with. But we have a political system that at the moment is structurally designed to prevent us from dealing with that problem, regardless of the outcome of the presidential election. 85 to 90% of the seats are gerrymandered, so that it's a locked-in vote. Now think about that. We've come to take this for granted ever since we heard about Eldridge Gary, and gerrymandering in 1812 in Massachusetts. If I can go to this website and I can maneuver this around, I can actually show you the original gerrymander. This is my website. I happen to be interested in these issues, and I've tried to put this information out for people, and if this works right, please come along, baby doll. Here we come. How am I going to scroll down here? It's a little different. Hey, what do you see up there? That is a map of the original gerrymander of 1812. This is the way a district was shaped. Okay, is that ridiculous or not? Well, you should see the way some of them are shaped, in Alabama, Virginia, Florida, Texas, Maryland, all over the country. This practice began back then, but it has become so sophisticated with modern computer software that political strategists and campaign workers for individual parties can literally design districts down to which street, not which neighborhood, not which zip code, but which street should be in which district in order to ensure their party the advantage. And what people don't know is that the outcome of the 2012 election was affected by the redistricting done in 2011, which was affected by the census of 2010, which was affected by Red Map. Red Map was a program. See if I got this in. It's on the same site here. Anybody who wants to join me, by the way, please get on your cell phone. Please get on your computer if you got it. Just go to reclaimtheamericandream.org. Go to the toolbar. Go to Issues. I see computers up there. Great, use them. Go to Issues, and then go to Gerrymandering, and then go down here, and you'll see this. And it will describe Red Map. Red Map was a program that Karl Rove, the Republican campaign guru for George W. Bush, organized with a bunch of other Republican national strategists in about 2009, after they lost the presidential election to Obama in 2008, and they said, we got to do something to protect the Republican Party. We're going to have to get a hammerlock on the House. And we can do that by going after control of state legislatures in the 2010 election, which is exactly what they did. They spent $30 million going after legislative seats to gain control of as many as many state legislative houses as they could. It was the Democrats were paying no attention. They were focused on the presidential race, which is one reason why I'm taking some time this afternoon to focus on the congressional races with you. They focused on the presidential race, and the Republicans went after, in 2010, they went after not the congressional races. They went after the legislative races. And they picked up 675 legislative seats nationwide, which put the Republican Party in control of the governor's chair and both houses of the state legislature, except in Nebraska where they only have one house, in states that controlled 40% of the seats in the House of Representatives. Democrats had that perfect control in states that controlled 10% of the seats in the House. And the other states were like Montana, where you got a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor. You got a mixed system, a mixed bag, okay? And when they got done with the partisan gerrymandering in 2011, they set up the election of 2012. So if you take what I told you before, that the Democrats got more votes than the Republicans, and you start looking at one state after another, in Pennsylvania, there are 18 House seats. The Democrats in Pennsylvania got more votes in Pennsylvania than the Republicans. But thanks to the Republican gerrymandering, the Republicans got more seats. Anybody want to guess? There are 18 seats. You think it should come out maybe 9-9? Maybe it should have come out 10-8 Democratic? Did it come out 10-8 Republican? No. 11-7 Republican? No. 12-6 Republican? No. 13-5. Republicans got 13 seats to 5 for the Democrats. All right, now you can say, and there are political scientists, and there are sociologists, and there are pollsters who will tell you, well, that's just the big sort. That's the way people live. Democrats live in cities, and you know, Democrats wind up by wasting votes because they're so concentrated in the cities, and you really can't do anything about it. Sorry, folks, that ain't true. A Democratic senator took the exact same vote, Democratic state senator in the state legislature of Pennsylvania, took exactly the same votes, and he redrew the district lines for congressional districts in Pennsylvania, and guess how they came out? 13 for the Democrats and 5 for the Republicans. So the way you draw the lines makes an enormous difference. I'll give you one more example. North Carolina. North Carolina, going into the 2010 election, was governed by a redistricting done by a Democratic-controlled legislature back in 2001 from the previous census. Democrats outpolled Republicans in North Carolina narrowly in 2010, and they had 7 seats to 6 for the Republicans. Pretty well reflected both the party registration and the popular vote. In the next election, after the Republicans had done the gerrymandering, because they won the state legislature, that was one of the states where the Republicans did really well in 2010, they did the gerrymandering in 2011. The vote, the popular vote in North Carolina in 2012 was almost identical to the popular vote in 2010. Only this time, instead of the Democrats having 7 and the Republicans having 6, the Republicans had 9 and the Democrats had 4. There are a bunch of other examples. I have no idea why regression analysis, which is widely used in American political science departments all over the country, will tell you that it doesn't make any difference. All I can tell you is, if you look at the facts on the ground, it makes an enormous difference. And I can go on and cite you more states if you want. Wisconsin, unbelievable. Michigan, unbelievable. Now, the Democrats do it too. It's both parties. I mean, I live in Maryland for a long time. In Maryland, Democrats outnumber Republicans about 2-1. There are 10 congressional districts. The Democratic gerrymandering in Maryland results in 9 Democratic seats and 1 Republican seat. It's outrageous. In Massachusetts and Connecticut, it's done by Democrats. The Republican vote in both of those states is about 1/3, and they're about 40–45% Democrats, and the rest are independents. By the way, you might be interested, particularly if you're in the millennial generation. More than half of the millennial generation is identified as political independents. You don't trust either party. I don't blame you. I don't trust either party either, okay? So you stay away. Guess what? In any kind of gerrymandered system, you have no vote for Congress. Understand, you have no vote for Congress. In Massachusetts, 62% of the voters are either Republican or independents. But the Democratic 38% of the vote decides every single victory in the congressional delegation in Massachusetts and in about 90% of the legislative districts in Massachusetts. And the same thing is true in Connecticut. So I'm not going after one party. Both parties are screwing us up. Now think about how they're screwing us up. Think how important this is. Go back to your civics class in high school. Do you remember how the Founding Fathers set up the election of our government? Do you remember? They set up an electoral college, right? They didn't trust the popular vote for president, so they were going to have electors. We still have this system, right? So the president wasn't elected by the people. The president's elected by an intermediate body, the electoral college, okay? The second thing is, we didn't have direct election of senators. Do you remember that? We didn't get direct election of senators until 1916, amendment to the Constitution. So the Founding Fathers didn't trust the public to elect senators. But they said, we're going to have one house. Do you remember the term they had for it? We're going to call it the People's House. Why? Because we're actually going to let the people elect the House of Representatives. And you know what else they said? We're going to have their elections every 2 years. Why? Because we want some way to take the thermometer of public opinion on a repeated and rapid basis so the government can be sensitive to what the people want. Well, what do you think the Founding Fathers would think today if they looked at a gerrymandered system in which 90% of the public vote is already determined? And then if you want to take a really interesting look at the turnout in the primaries. In the party primaries in about 20 states, the turnout is somewhere between 5 and 10% of the electorate. Do you know that Ted Cruz got nominated by the Republican Party in Texas to become a United States Senator with 2% of the vote of a state of 27 million people? I mean, it's incredible when you think of the distortion of the whole idea of democracy. So here we are going through, it's not a charade, but it's getting close to being a charade, folks. We're going through an exercise of trying to pick a government and say, we want you to do something about international trade agreements, or we don't. We want you to do something about the turmoil in the Middle East, or we don't. We want you to confront Vladimir Putin in Ukraine and Syria, or we don't. We want you to fix Medicare and Social Security, or we don't. We're trying to get a verdict from the public to tell the government. And we have a system set up to block the public. And if you want to take a real close look at how that has an impact in Washington, do you remember when John Boehner got overthrown? Okay, John Boehner got overthrown because roughly 45 people in the House caucus, the House Republican caucus, opposed him. I went and checked on all those 45 people. All but one of them came from gerrymandered districts. Now the public is saying, and these were also, by the way, these were also people who voted to shut down the government in 2013, okay? So you say, you look at opinion polls, and the public in opinion polls is saying, don't shut down the government. These folks come from districts where a 7 or 8% turnout says shut down the government. So you've got a deadlock, a gridlock here that is caused by and exacerbated by a political system that is broken because gridlock is baked into it by gerrymandering. Now, I've taken a lot of time on this point, and I've taken a lot of time on this point because there is much focus in the country today on the pernicious and corrupting impact of money in our political system. And for good reason. It has a terrible impact. But there's very little focus in the media and in public attention on the issue that I've just talked to you about. Now, that might be enough for you to throw up your hands and say, what the hell are we going to do about this in this system of ours? And one of the feelings that people have is that there's not much the public can do. I'm going to tell you something that you're not going to read in the media. Today, 25 out of the 50 states in the United States are engaged in a fight against gerrymandering. You wouldn't know that by reading the media. People are starting to understand what I've been talking to you about. There are 7 states that have thrown out the state legislature from doing the job because they know that politicians sitting in the state legislature are going to draw the district lines to keep themselves in office. Just the same way that businesses want a monopoly, so do politicians. Nothing new, okay? 3 other states have systems that are similar to that. They're marked. The ones that have, well, look at this. You're up there. You're looking good, Montana. How about that, okay? There are a whole bunch of other states like you. Most of them, by the way, in the West. You know why? Because you have the process of popular initiative and referendum. It's real hard to fix that back east. But here's some others that are working on it, okay? There are 7 other states that are working on this. There are 6 states where there are lawsuits attacking gerrymandering, mostly on racial grounds in states like Texas, North Carolina, Virginia, but also in Wisconsin where race is not an issue. The point is that people are starting to wake up to the fact that the whole idea of American democracy is being frustrated by incumbent politicians who are interested in keeping themselves in office. Now, where am I going? Where I'm going is we are not going to deal with the problems of reclaiming the American dream unless we deal with these issues. You've dealt with some of them up here in Montana. You need to keep pushing ahead on these issues. You need to encourage your neighbors to keep doing it too. We need to get a hold on, and by the way, you also, there's another map I can show you. You look good on another map. One of the other things that I track is what states have taken action to call for the rollback of Citizens United, calling for an amendment to the Constitution. There must be a bunch of people in this room who actually were part of this vote in 2012. Okay? You voted. Does anybody remember what the vote was? Can I get a volunteer from the... Here we are. There's Montana looking good in another map. 3 to 1. Who said that? 3 to 1. 73% of the popular vote. Republicans, Democrats, Independents, almost identical. By the way, the same thing happened in Colorado. In Colorado, it passed the same year. In Colorado, the push to amend the Constitution to roll back Citizens United, which is the Supreme Court decision that allows unlimited corporate spending in campaigns, was also about 73%. It carried in every single county of the state of Colorado. Red counties, purple counties, and blue counties. It's going to happen again in Washington State. It is now on the ballot in Washington State. It's happening again. So the point is, reform is on the move in this country. But the media is not telling us the story. I'm going to end in a funny place here. Why not? I asked a journalism class this morning whether or not they thought the media was biased. Hands went up slowly. Yes. Anybody want to say whether or not you think the media is biased? Sir, you have any thoughts on that?
Do I think they're biased?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that most of the media is biased, but not necessarily one way.
Yeah? Just they're biased one way or another. And is it pretty well canceled out? I mean, CNN is maybe liberal and Fox is conservative or whatever. Is that what you have in mind?
I don't know. I guess I would say, I'm a Democrat, and I would say that most people perceive that the Democrats are, this is much more biased towards the liberal side of the equation, but I don't.
No, I mean the media. You think the media is biased towards or against the Democrats, or in any way?
The vast majority of the public thinks that the media is biased towards the liberal side of things.
Yeah.
I think I don't think that.
Yeah, okay. Can I get a different viewpoint? I want to, yes, ma'am.
I think what you said earlier is maybe more true, that they're just interested in the exciting story.
Woo! Ooh, are you smart? But I want to go a little bit further than that. That's a very interesting observation because the way we tend to look at things in this country is left or right, conservative or liberal, Republican or Democrat, but often bias is very different from that. I think the media has very serious biases, but they're not that yet. This woman is coming close. How about a student way in the back? You look kind of edgy back there. You got any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably all directed by marketing money, you might ask.
Oh, no, wait, that's a very interesting part of the answer. Tell me what you mean by that.
What I mean is, since usually peer-derived headlines get people's attention, that they cause, you know, the ratings numbers are based on.
Oh, what a devilish mind you have up there. So the ratings matter? Any matter for people's egos, or is there something else going on? Money, oh yeah, money. Do you know that I actually have been alive and a practicing journalist long enough to remember when networks accepted that news departments were lost leaders, that they actually did their job to serve American democracy and they didn't have to make a profit? Richard Paley was famous for this, Bill Paley was famous for this at CBS. What's happened is, particularly with the networks, but also in cable news, it's run by businesses. They've now been bought by businesses, and the businesses have told the news divisions, you must be a profit center. You want to be a profit center, you got to drive up your ratings. What drives up your ratings? Analyzing Donald Trump's policies? No, repeating his insults against Meghan, right? That really drives up the ratings. That's where the bias is. Yes?
I've heard it argued that when use of the airways was originally licensed, the deal between the government, which
The
had
FCC.
control of it in the person of the FCC, was you can use the airwaves, which the whole public owns, but in return, you have to do something for the Republic, and the deal they struck was, we'll do the news, and we'll eat that, and then we'll do stuff to make money for the rest of them.
You got part of it. Part of what they had to do was to get their licenses either initially or get them renewed, was they had to commit themselves to cover the news. But there was something even more important. It was called the Fairness Doctrine, which said that if you're Rush Limbaugh or if you're somebody on the other side, then you've got to give the other side. If you're on the right, you've got to give the left. If you're on the left, you've got to give the right, until 1987. And then the Fairness Doctrine disappeared. So that was very, very important. Huge change, the profit-making of the businesses and the relaxation of the Fairness Doctrine. What I want to get to you is, I'm going to surprise you, I think, by saying the media bias that I notice in Washington is definitely pro-Tea Party. And it's pro-Tea Party because of what we reporters regard our function to be in Washington. We are watchdogs for the people against the government. Our job is to tell you and show you and track all the time whenever the IRS is being nasty to somebody, whenever the Pentagon is making bad contracts, whenever the environmental agency allows BP to set up a bad rig in the Gulf of Mexico and it blows and causes enormous pollution. Whatever it is, our job is to show how the government is failing. Well, if you show that repeatedly over time, the general impression is going to be the government's failing. We almost never tell a positive story. We have an enormous bias built in, and it's partly our notion of how we're going to serve you, the public, and how we're going to serve a democracy. And we're going to serve you by protecting you from bad guys and bad gals in the government. But we're not going to take a lot of time to tell you, the FBI is working pretty well, or the national parks are doing well, or actually the Pentagon did something right, or whatever, or somebody called it right. Yeah, we may write one story, but the other story we'll write again and again and again and again. So the bias that gets built into the coverage is negative. So I can tell you, my friends, in the media in Washington are not interested in the stories that I just told you, the 25 states are doing something about gerrymandering. They're not interested in the story about 16 states and 700 cities doing something about rolling back Citizens United. Yes, it gets reported one day, but the trend, but if something is going negative, we'll report that story again and again. So one of the things I'm trying to bring out to you is, number one, the structural problems we have to dealing with the critical issues that we face as a nation. And secondly, that the media isn't helping us figure out that, in fact, we the people can do something about this. One of my favorite slogans on this site, if I can get back to it properly, is this. It's up to us. As a nation of people who believe in democracy, we've gotten to the point where we're so discouraged, in some cases so cynical, in other cases so disengaged, that we've stopped believing that we can actually do something to fix our own system. If we believe that, we're not going to be able to fix our own system. We have to believe that it is up to us to fix it, that the politicians aren't going to do it, because it's not in their interest to fix it. They're doing quite well, thank you very much, in the system we've got, which is a lousy system, but they're doing okay. It's up to us, and then we have to believe we can do something about it. I think I'll end by quoting a friend of mine by the name of Ernie Cortez, who's an organizer in Texas. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California. He's Hispanic, he's a terrific guy, very smart. And we were talking about politics one day and power. Power we were talking about. And he said, Rick, you remember that saying from Lord Acton, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely? He said, powerlessness also corrupts. Powerlessness also corrupts. It corrupts democracy at the core. If we believe we can't change things, if we believe the folks with money and power, from the corporations, from the billionaires, from the trade unions, from whoever it is, who seems more powerful than we are, then in fact we cede to them the power. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It's a participatory sport. And it's not a sport that can be played only at election time, because all the damage is done between elections. It's particularly done after the people have spoken out clearly. The lobbyists in Washington go to work the morning after the election to undo the results of the election. And the trouble is, they're very, very effective at it. So we have to turn this around. If I can leave you with one thing, it's up to us, and we can do it, and we need to be engaged. And it's people in rooms like this who care about these issues, who care about our country, who are passionate about our democracy, and who know their own future, particularly those of you who are students and are young. Your future's a long time to come. You've got to be involved. We've got to be involved. One of the exciting things to me about this election is the degree to which young people have gotten involved and gotten engaged, largely because of Bernie Sanders, but they've gotten engaged. It's really important that we be engaged. Thank you very much. Now, we have another bit, a little bit of time. Yeah, so I'm open to any kind of question you want to go to. I'm just going to try not to say some of the things I'm going to say tonight.
Thank you for your closing comment. I concur that participation is the antidote to powerlessness, so that was a wonderful closing comment. Thank you. So I want to go back to the media, though, and its responsibility. One thing I've always been curious about is the lack of critique that comes from the media when our politicians or elected leaders or corporate leaders say things that are patently false and yet are allowed to get away with it. I read things in our local paper by our, certain political entities that are making claims that, there's still a lot of uncertainty about global warming, or that there, might be all these immigrants that are going to come in who are unvetted and terribly dangerous to us. Neither of which is true. Neither of which has any support in the scientific.
You're probably right, but how do you know that these are not true?
Because I am a scientist and I pay attention to.
So you got your own sources.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Well, I would maintain.
Sources are available to all of us.
Yeah.
And it's not as if a journalist can't tap into those sources and maybe say, well, this person is saying this, but go to the National Academy of Sciences or go to the State Department, wherever it might be, who have actually explored these things, and their conclusions are these.
Right.
And so we're offering a rebuttal to these outrageous and inflammatory statements that get a free pass.
Well, I have to say I couldn't agree with you more, first of all, to start with. Secondly, I would say that if you weren't a scientist and you were a really alert reader of really good newspapers, you actually could have found those things out in really good newspapers, okay? So it is available. Some of that information is available, but nowhere near as much as it should be. So the question is, why does it happen, and is there anything we can do about it, okay? It happens in a lot of cases out of lack of courage, okay? Reporters are told, and journalism students are told, you got to be neutral. You can't take one side or the other. So somebody says something, and you do what I call ping pong journalism. You go to the people on the other side. It was classically represented in the death panels that were supposedly written into Obamacare, right? So the Republicans said, Sarah Palin said specifically, there are death panels in there. And so the reporters quoted Sarah Palin, and then they went to a bunch of Democrats, George Miller or something like that in the House of Representatives, Democrat from California. Are there death panels? He says no. Oh, okay. So Sarah Palin says yes. He says no. That's the end of it. No, it's not the end of it. You go look at the legislation, and is it in there or isn't it in there? It's not in there. So she's full of you know what. Okay. So it's a falling down on the job. In the first place, it's a falling down on the job of the editors, because a lot of the reporters are young. They're not used to it. They don't have much political experience and history, so they're uncertain. But it is a lack of courage on the part of the media, okay? There are lots of other examples. Can we do something about it? Yes. Yes. You as readers can do, and viewers can do something about it. There's an opening that's been offered by the media itself. And it's a very interesting institution. It's called fact check, right? So somebody says something in a campaign ad. The press has finally gotten to the idea that we should go check the facts in a campaign ad. And I don't know what you all do here, but the Washington Post awards Pinocchios. How long is the nose, right? How big is the lie is the question. So they do that, okay? So they award, and 5 Pinocchios, you're way over the edge, right? You might as well retire. It doesn't seem to have any effect on some politicians. They go right on lying on top of it, but at least the public is told, okay? So if newspapers are willing to do that, and television stations are willing to do that, why don't we as readers and viewers go to them and say, how about doing that outside of the campaign? This is a great feature. This is a great service you're doing to our society. Why don't you expand it into other areas? When people are talking about climate change, when people are talking about health care, when people are talking about the impact of certain drugs, when people are talking about causes of floods, when people are talking about Flint, Michigan, whatever, why don't you keep doing that? And I mean, we need to be pushed. The media needs to be pushed by an alert and intelligent public that isn't just saying you're doing it wrong. They're right. But you know how many people change when you tell them they're doing it wrong, right? Not very many people do. But if you say, you know, we don't like the way you're doing this, but what you're doing over here is really clever. Could you move that over to this area here? Then people say, oh, well, you know, we could take a little credit. So let's use our smarts. So, I mean, I think you're raising a very important question. I mean, I hesitate to say what I'm saying because I'm an older journalist. The quality of reporting out of Congress and out of Washington today, it just is not as good as it used to be. And part of it is there's so many people, and it's not just that they're young, it's that they haven't had either the history courses, they haven't had the experience beforehand. There are a lot of new media that are throwing people into jobs that they're really not very well prepared for. You have another problem, which is that most staffs have shrunk. So people are trying to do way too much work. They don't have anywhere near enough time. The news media don't have anywhere near enough the resources. I mean, the resources to go check that out and to do a really good job, it takes time. It takes a commitment. And it takes a kind of grit in the teeth to do it. And so the economics of the news business are fighting that. The 24/7 cycle is fighting that. Be in a hurry, get out there first, don't worry about whether or not it's right, which is a crazy notion. But it nonetheless is driving the media. So any ways we can find to encourage the media to use its better instincts and its better traditions and its better methods is a gain. And I just, but you raise a really important point. Yes, sir.
To that.
Sure.
One of the ways that media are intimidated
That's
from
right.
fact-checking or following up is the threat of denial of access. How do they beat that?
That's a really good question. I've run into that throughout my career, okay? Part of it is you have to have a good, strong news organization and news leadership behind you. In other words, if you're the reporter out at the point and you say, I got to write this, and if I write this, and say you're covering the White House, let me tell you, covering the White House is one of the dullest jobs there is. Do you know why? They absolutely flood you with statements and information and press releases all the time. So all you can do to keep up with them. And if you ever want to get behind the news, you've got to have some time away from all that to go talk to people who work in the White House or work elsewhere in the government to find out what's really going on, right? That's the access that they can deny you. The visible access, you can't get an interview with the president. You're not going to get an interview with the president anyway, unless you're lucky in one of the major news organizations and so forth. So you have to have a news organization that says, okay, if that's what you found out, we're going to go ahead with the report, and if you get shut out, we're going to live with it. A lot of reporters don't have that behind them. So they're intimidated, and so they buckle. But, you know, I want to tell you something. My experience, when I left the New York Times, I really moved in economic reporting. The denial of access in the economy, in the business world and the medical world, is far more severe than it is in politics. Politicians know they need eventually to deal with the public, and the media are a means to it. Businesses don't. Businesses need to deal with their competition, with their shareholders, with their big shareholders, and they're going to deal with them in a private phone call. I can tell you it's really tough. If you're investigating a medical story where somebody's really blown it in an operation in a hospital, I mean, you get things thrown at you. This is patient privacy. You can't possibly. This isn't patient privacy. You guys have a very interesting privacy case going on right now in the state of Montana. I won't get into that, but this isn't patient privacy. You're talking about. Was there infection in the operating room at the time this person was being operated on? Is there a record? Can we go back and look at the record and see whether or not you have a higher incidence of post-operative infection than you did 2 or 3 years ago? And if so, why? Boy, I want to tell you, they shut that stuff down. That's very hard stuff to get at, okay? And in business, you know, if you want to find out if a business has done something wrong, it's very difficult. The stories the New York Times has done about Walmart buying its way into the market in Mexico and into India, the stories about Apple working out its tax shelters in Ireland and Microsoft, those are very tough stories to break. I mean, we're back to the amount of time it takes. They had reporters working on these stories for months. For months. What news organizations can afford to invest 2 or 3 of their top reporters' time for months to break a story? They're convinced it's A, that important, B, it's symptomatic of a system that's gone awry, and C, this is what the integrity of journalism is about. So the answer is, depends upon who you are and where you are, what kind of clout you have behind you, and what kind of backing you have from your corporate or your news leadership. Yes, sir.
So as a role as a superpower, and going back to kind of your generation with the time that you spent in Russia and then our involvement in Vietnam and Korea and even today in our involvement in Iraq, we're supposed to be establishing all these democracies and we're supposed to, lots of countries follow in our footsteps. In fact, I spent 2 months in Cambodia representing the Department of State, working with their political system. And they take a lot of pointers, and countries, again, like Iraq, where we specifically go in there to set up democracies. How do you see their countries developing when we're doing all this stuff like gerrymandering and earlocked Congresses and stuff, just as far as being role models for these countries that we're supposed to be promoting?
Well, did you all hear the question? Okay. Well, it's a disaster. It's a disaster. I mean, in the first place, I've worked in about 40 countries overseas. And I think it's a mistake for us to think that we can set up democracies. Okay, so number one, I don't go with the basic proposition. If there are people that are on the road to democracy on their own, and they want help in writing a constitution, devising a legal system, helping them to set up a free press and so on, but getting in there and telling the prime minister how the heck he should be dealing with the Shiite or the Sunni minority and all that kind of stuff in Iraq, that's rough stuff. I mean, that's a presumption that we're God and we're all wise. And my experience of Americans is we're not very good at understanding other cultures. And I've spent a lot of time in a bunch of different ones, in Asia, in the Middle East, in the Slavic world, and Russia. So I think we have to be much more cautious about what we can do, number one. Number two, clearly, they look to us as a model. And if they see us, and I think that's one of the problems we're having today. Obama is being blamed today for a kind of retrenchment of the world's view of America. Listen, we all have done that. This isn't the president. You can argue about the president's policies one way or another, but people around, the Chinese are mocking us. The Chinese are saying democracy is a nutty idea if they're talking to other people in Asia. Look at how screwed up America is and what they can't do. It's not about Obama, it's about what I've been talking about here. They can see we can't solve these problems. If you're sitting in Singapore, you're sitting in Korea, or you're in the Philippines, you've got historic ties with America, and that's what's keeping you there. But the way American democracy is functioning, it's not what's keeping you there. It's a serious problem for us. And this isn't just me talking off the top of my head. The Pew Center for the Public and the Media does regular polling around the world about how American democracy is viewed. And you can see the changes in the numbers. I mean, and we're talking not about hostile countries. You're talking about places like Morocco, Cambodia, New Zealand, Scandinavia. So these are countries that could be open to us or not open to us, and their view of us has gone down as a society. Think of what it means to a country that's trying to put together a coalition government. When they see Obama negotiating with the Iranian government for a nuclear deal to try to control nuclear weapons, and if they don't have nuclear weapons and don't aspire to them, they have to think that's something good for the world and good for them. And 40+ senators from the opposition party, in the midst of the negotiations, send a letter to the other government and say, don't make a deal with our president because the next president may not abide by it. He may be from our party. I can tell you, I've been covering Washington for 40 years. Not in all those 40 years have I ever seen either party, Republican or Democrat, opposition, step in the midst of a negotiation to tell a foreign government not to make the deal because we won't honor it if we gain power. It's just incredible. So this is not just sloppy. This is not just partisanship. This is absolutely undermining the notion of how you run an effective government. Yes, in the back. I'll get you.
Doesn't that speak to how our society has become more radicalized to both ends, where we used to be more closer in the middle of the road to each other?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning of your question. Could I say what happened?
Doesn't that speak to how our society has become more radicalized to either extreme versus the more traditional?
Yeah, there's no question about that. And there are probably 2 or 3 things that have happened. But one of them is the gerrymandering that I mentioned. Okay? Part of it is that people come from safe districts with small turnouts. The people who turn out in primary elections are usually the party regulars, and they tend to be more extreme than the middle-of-the-road voters. So you tend to get people nominated in those gerrymandered districts who are more extreme at both ends and both parties, okay? And when they get to Washington, they're sitting at the ends of the field. You don't have anybody playing in the middle. That's one thing that's happened. There are a lot of other things that happen, but there's also something that's happened that's salient in the campaign this year. There was a very interesting story in the New York Times 3 days ago by a team of economists who were studying the impact on politics and polarization of the impact of foreign trade and the loss of jobs. And what they did was they began talking to people and polling people in areas where there had been severe job loss. And what they found out was that people went in both directions. They went both to the extreme right and to the extreme left. And the middle got lost because people are feeling vulnerable. In one set of people, their tendency was to blame foreigners, to blame immigration, to blame Mexicans, to blame foreign trade deals, whatever it is. You can hear it. I'm not naming a candidate, but this is way pre the candidate. These guys did this research before Donald Trump even announced he was going to be a candidate, okay? And on the other side, people were saying, we need more government action, we need protectionism, but they were moving in opposite directions. So you have both the change in our political system's structure and its structural problems, and the impact of economic pain. Economic pain tends to make people, and you can look at the history of Europe, the rise of Hitler, you can look at what Stalin was able to do, you can look at different periods of American history. When there's acute economic stress, politics tend to get more extreme. There are charts that political scientists have done that show that political polarization rises over the last century of American history, rises when there is greater income inequality, and it falls when there is less income inequality. So you're seeing the interaction of economics and politics here. But there's no question that the kind of action that I was just talking about to the previous questioner is an outcome of what you were talking about. Absolutely. Yes, you had your hand up.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the effect of corporate ownership of media and the concentration of ownership of media in the United States, and what kind of effect that may have on what we hear in the news and what we don't hear. Because it seems to me it's not only that we get all of the sensational stuff that Lori was talking about, but it's that distracts the media from covering the important stuff that they are.
Do you all hear the question back here? What's the impact on the media and what the media reports and maybe doesn't report from greater corporate control of media outlets? I can't cite to you studies that are rooted in detailed facts, but I would say from personal observation, there's a great tendency with a corporate-owned media to go with conventional news and views. That is, you tend to reinforce. Reporters operate in what you might call a safe comfort zone of coverage, and they don't venture out of that. And that's where you begin to discover really interesting news. The biggest test for me, and I probably will mention this tonight, but the biggest test for me is that those of us in the media, and I include myself in this, failed to report the biggest story that was developing in America over the last 30 years until Occupy, which was the increasing inequality of income in America, okay? We reported such and such a factory closed. We reported the poverty rate was this level. We reported bits and pieces of it, but we didn't put it together and understand what was really going on. We now have a grasp of that, and it's now covered today. But part of that is it's a failure to challenge ourselves to connect the dots and make sense out of the news and out of society. And part of that is traveling the comfortable groove of acceptable news. So this is somewhat related to the question asked by the gentleman next to you. What if you're afraid of getting cut off by access? A lot of us human beings are conformist. And so we tend, I have to tell you, at the time we went to war in Iraq, I was working on a program for Frontline, which didn't get on the air. I was working on a program for Frontline that basically said Saddam does not have weapons of mass destruction, okay? This is really counter to where everything was going. Everything in the media, everything public officials were saying and that kind of stuff. But there were indications from Hans Blick at the United Nations. There was a very interesting story about a son-in-law of Saddam Hussein who defected to Jordan and who admitted to Western intelligence that they had been working on nuclear weapons. And then he said they had stopped the program, and I forget what the year was, but he said, told them, well, they jumped on the fact that he admitted they had it because it confirmed what they wanted to believe. But if this guy, in the intelligence business and in the news business, you rate sources. You rate sources on their access to the news and their reliability. The top you can be is A1. A for access, you got the best access in the world, and 1 for reliability. Well, there's no question that Saddam Hussein's son-in-law was an A. And they took him as a 1 when he told them what they wanted, and they took him as a 4 when he told them what they didn't want to hear. So, I mean, so I had picked up stuff like that. It was very difficult to do that kind of reporting, and even for a very good outlet that I was working on, they didn't want to wait for the story. There was a guy named Walter Pincus working for the Washington Post, and he was also working on similar stuff in the Washington Post, and there were people in the intelligence community, mavericks, who had this idea. The problem was it's almost impossible to prove a negative, and you can always raise the suspicion of a positive. So it's very difficult to prove a negative. And so I kept running into that. It's very hard to break out. I mean, number one, it takes a mindset and a determination to do it. It takes a suspicious mind. It takes tenacity. And then it, again, I'm back to...
And it would take Frontline being willing to...
Yeah, and Frontline, in fairness to them, they were in a hurry to get a story, and somebody else had sort of a part of the story, and they went with a part of the story. And my answer was, you're going to come out with a weak story, and it's not going to make the point that needs to be made. And months later, they said, well, you were right. But we felt we had to make a fast decision. You had a question before. Let me get to somebody else. I'm sure it's a good one. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering, so we talked about the growing millennial population. Do you foresee the independent party emerging in the next 25 years when the millennials?
I want to tell you something. One of the things that most disturbs me about the American media today is it spends too much time making predictions. Okay? This is from a guy who just made a prediction to you. But I made, okay. So I'm going to be honest about it. But I made a prediction to you on the basis of a structure of facts, okay? I don't have any idea how to answer your question. What I do, my job is to try to tell you what I see and what the evidence is of what's going on. It doesn't take a genius to see that the Republican Party, it may be breaking up, but it's certainly in the process of fragmenting. And the Democratic Party's got big fragments in it too. And the third thing is the percentage of people in America who declare themselves independents is growing. That does not, in my mind, necessarily mean they're going to be part of an independent party, because fundamentally they're turning their away from a party system. And you should know something else that's really interesting. This is only just beginning to happen. We have had a tradition for 150 years or more of party primaries as a way to nominate candidates for office, right? We have terms that we've learned in history, open and closed primaries, okay? They're all closed. The only thing that's open about them is you can choose which one you want to go into. But once you go into a Republican or a Democratic primary, in a state that has a so-called open primary, you have to vote for the candidates. You have to choose among the candidates within that party. You can't jump across and say, well, I'll take a Republican for governor and a Democrat for lieutenant governor. You can do that in the general, but you can't do that in a primary. We now have 2 states that have nonpartisan, 3 states that have nonpartisan primaries, which is a very interesting idea. To me, the idea of elections is voter choice. It's not about supporting parties. It's about voter choice. And people who are independent are also talking about voter choice. The problem is becoming an independent is actually denying you choice because we have a primary system, okay? But Washington State, in 2008, instituted a nonpartisan primary in which the top 2 candidates for any office in the primary, everybody ran in the primary, everybody. Blues, greens, reds, everything. Democrats, Republicans, independents, all right, everybody voted. And the top 2 move on to the general election so that we have somebody who's elected with a majority vote, okay? Well, what's happened in Washington State is really interesting. Turnout has gone up. More people are voting because they got a choice. We now have actually the beginning of a rebirth of moderate Republicans and conservative Democrats because there's a pressure on people in both parties to run closer to the center. If you want to win in an open primary, you can't really be at the far end. But it's really interesting, and I think it's the 4th district in Washington State, which is a heavily Republican district, okay? There was a Republican running who had sat in the cabinet of the previous Democratic governor. Very well-known political figure, but he'd sat with the Democrats, which suggests this is a guy who can sort of do business with both sides, right? And he was running against a really strong Tea Party candidate in a quite conservative district. In the primary, the Tea Party guy won, and the moderate Republican was second. In the general election, where the rest of the candidates were removed, the moderate won and the Tea Party ran second. If there had been a party primary, the moderate guy never would have gotten into the general, and the Tea Party guy would have gotten elected, okay? And I can tell you a story about Seattle's 1st district where the opposite happened on the Democratic side. So people need to wake up to that potential. Voters have more choice. There's a chance to restore the political middle by operating that way. The incentives are, and the incentives also begin to reduce the pressure for negative advertising. I mean, people are turned off by negative advertising, but they respond to it, and particularly in party primaries. So we could be going in that direction. I doubt we're going to see an independent party, but I don't know. We might see something different than the Republican Party, and it might be called something else. I don't know. There's no question there's upheaval. There's no question there's more turmoil in party ID and resentment against party organizations than we've seen in the last 40 or 50 years. That I know. Yes, sir.
So you talked in part about kind of money and how party politics will influence, membership in the legislature.
Can you talk just a little louder?
Sorry, you talked a lot about how party politics and money will influence political participation, like the legislative, congressional houses. But one of the things that I see as a problem is that a lot of these organizations, like the Business Roundtable, are also very active in filing like amicus briefs in the judicial system to influence kind of post-policy outcomes.
Right.
And I was wondering what possible solution to that would be.
Yeah, well, I've been talking a lot about politics, election and lobbying and the influence of money in campaigns. He's saying, I think with good reason, that some of the most powerful lobbying organizations are active in the courts, such as the Business Roundtable filing amicus briefs in courts. And what can I say about post-election political influence? Not a hell of a lot. I'm sorry to say. I'm aware of it. I just haven't studied it. The one thing that you can say with some pretty good certainty is that the tilt of Supreme Court decisions, Supreme Court, now I don't know about other courts, Supreme Court decisions over the last 30 or 40 years has been, 30 or 40 years, has been significantly more pro-business and anti-labor and anti-consumer than it was prior to that. And if you look at my book, and I will talk about this tonight, you see the rise. The Business Roundtable did not exist in 1971. And I talk about the political revolution that begins with the Lewis Powell memo of 1971. And Powell himself goes on the court, and Powell himself writes any number of pro-business decisions. So there's a shift in political influence and power that occurred in Washington, and certainly in the courts that's visible. But I have not studied that in any depth, so I can't knowledgeably add to what you already raised and what I just said. Anybody else back there? I think one of our obligations in the media is to say what we don't know when we don't know. Yes.
I was going to say, with the tendency of the media to like to cover the sensationalist aspect of politics, seems to have also added fire to this old game of blame the other side then, that politicians love to use.
No question about it.
Do you see any trends there in terms of the media being able to sort through the blame game issues more and get more to the underlying issues, or is
Well, I hate to tell you, there's a big chunk of the media that doesn't want to sort it out, okay? Because they see this, I mean, do you remember a program called Crossfire? And anybody say, the whole idea was to generate heat and not light. I mean, I can tell you, I was on that show sometimes, and there were veterans of that show, and they really knew how to play that game. Man, it was like watching a fastball go by at the plate. I mean, I had stopped to think about giving an answer, and 3 people had already shot each other dead by the time I could get. You know, I mean, I hated it. I went on it several times because I regarded it as a challenge as a newsman to try to do it, but I'm not good at that game. No, there are people who want that. There are people who absolutely love that. You know, and you can see it. There are even people, this is coming very close to home, PBS and my good friend Jim Lehrer. Now, Jim Lehrer was doing this for the reasons I was just relating to this other gentleman earlier. If you get Jim Lehrer in a dialogue when he was hosting the NewsHour, and he got a senator that attacked some bill, you better believe he had the senator from the other side, and he would say, Senator Jones just said this. Senator Miller, what do you think? And he would go back, ping pong. Now, do we need some debate? Obviously. Is that helpful? Yes. But that's also a failure. Jim Lehrer was the favorite moderator of presidential debates of presidential candidates and their strategists. Guess why? Okay. So, no, I don't see that. I hate to tell you, I don't see the media moderating that. I think the best way you're going to do it is what I said to this gentleman earlier, is to say, look, you do fact-checking. How about doing fact-checking? That's part of your job. Part of your job is calling balls and strikes. You got to tell us when the ball is foul. You got to tell us when it's a strike. In your best judgment with the best work that you can do. And when you don't do that, don't go out on the playing field. Don't pretend you're an umpire, okay? Stay in the stands with the rest of us. Make your honker noises, whatever you want to do, you know. But you know, give them the Bronx cheer, but don't pretend you're an umpire. I mean, I think we ought to be held to that standard, and that's fair. Yes, sir. Wait a minute. I got to get. Sorry, I keep trying to get people who haven't said anything. Yes, please.
So, in all of this discussion of the American dream, we haven't talked about a much more difficult challenge, namely that we are in the early period of extended, maybe decades long, of low growth, driven by demographics, driven by our own technology, driven by our own ability to produce great amounts of things at less and less cost.
Will you come this evening?
Pardon me?
Will you come this evening? It's one of my topics.
Okay.
Okay? No, I mean, if there are people that are coming, I really don't want to. I mean, that's central to what. That's central to what I'm going to try and talk about politics this afternoon. Tonight, I'm going to talk about economics and politics. Okay?
The challenge is we can't fix that.
We can, but we haven't figured out a way to do it. And one of the reasons we haven't figured out a way to do it is we got a busted political system which won't let us deal with that. Let me just give you one example, which I will use tonight, but at least it'll help you. We have an infrastructure in this country that is costing us jobs and competitiveness. We have backward highways, backward railways, backward ports, backward seaports, and not a terribly modern telecommunications system, and certainly in terms of green energy, not a very good infrastructure system, okay? So we're in trouble. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has estimated that we've lost $1 trillion of growth in the last 5 years by not modernizing our transportation structure, okay? So where do we get the money? Well, the private sector doesn't want to put up the money unless it's got government loan guarantees. We got a few people in Congress who don't want the government either to spend any money or set up any government loan guarantees, okay? So the president says, why don't we get the money from the private sector by allowing the American companies that have stashed $2.3 trillion of profits overseas to bring it home, and we'll give them a tax break. Instead of charging them the 35% that's the normal corporate tax rate, we'll charge them 15% or 20%, something like that. And the corporations are saying, oh, that's not good enough. We can't possibly do that. But if we let us bring it home, we'll generate jobs in America. We guarantee we can generate jobs. Well, somebody went back and did a little research, and the last time we did that, they got a 5.5% tax rate under the Bush administration in 2005. And the Center for Economic Priorities went back and studied what they did with the money, and 95% of it went to stock buybacks, dividends, and corporate executive bonuses, okay? They spent 5% on jobs. So we don't want to do that again. Now, we could intelligently get to a smart solution of that problem, which would make us more productive and which would generate different estimates, anywhere from 500 to 1 million jobs over a period of 5 years. That doesn't solve all our employment problems at all, but it begins to help generate a better growth rate. People estimate it would add either 0.3 or 0.5% to the national growth rate. That's a help. That's only one thing to do. We can't get to that with the political system that we got now. We can't get to that with a gerrymandered system. We might in the next presidency, but the odds aren't good for it, okay? So there are things that we can do to ameliorate that situation. I'll say one other thing. There is good economic evidence that whenever you have high inequality of income, you have slow growth. I'll go into why, but there's good evidence for that. So there are things we can do. They're within the knowledge of people who are either in the policy apparatus or connected to the policy apparatus. Nobel Prize winning economists and that kind of stuff, okay? Yes, sir.
I hope this isn't too central a question because it might take some time to answer this. It seems to me that others have described our situation as close to fascism, given the extreme corporate control that occurs in our country. It makes it almost impossible to solve some of the problems that you so eloquently discussed. And we're very grateful to you for that. But can we really make any serious progress until we've done something basic to overthrow a system which is based on greed rather than popular general welfare?
Well, the odds are tough, but they're getting better. The odds are tough, they're getting better. And you're taking me once again to what I'm going to talk about tonight. This election is a really interesting election. I mean, it's a real upheaval. It's a very different election than we have had in a long time. And not for the reasons that my friends in the media have described. I'm only going to tell you that tonight if you come. It is a different kind of election than we have had in at least 30 years and maybe longer than that. And it's because of what you're talking about. It's because of what you're talking about. And is it going to work? I don't know. I think in terms of, as a country, we are in a situation of fundamental discord about the economic fruits of growth and prosperity. Back to that gentleman's question. And I don't know whether or not it's as serious an upheaval as it was prior to the Civil War, but just to use an analogy, I feel as though where we are in our awareness and our political mobilization, we're at about 1852. Not at 1860. I don't think this is the last election that's going to be fought on this, and that's why this woman's question is so interesting. I think if we have another financial collapse, and I don't think they fixed the financial system, if we have another financial collapse and taxpayers are asked to bail out Wall Street banks again, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't believe it's going to be Occupy again. Or if it's Occupy, I don't think it's going to be as mild as it was. And if it's Occupy, it's not going to melt away as quickly. This country is in deep, deep, deep divide. So join me at, what time is it, 8 o'clock? And we'll carry this further.